Hello and welcome. My name is Marta, and today we will talk about good note taking as a speaker. Writing down notes is actually very important, even though I don't think it is a very developed skill today or a skill that we pay a lot of attention to. However, I think that messy notes often lead to a very messy speech. Too often, for example, we see debaters not having a clear idea on what they have actually written down, and they then stop mid-speech and disrupt the flow of their speech. Also, for example, we can write down too much on our paper. We often, in the end up with feeling dissatisfied with our speech because we felt that there is so much more that we could have said, but we just did not have the time for it, and then we kind of blame our note taking for it. I think it is also very challenging to write good notes as a speaker, since basically these are very specific notes. You don't need them to be fully ready transcripts of your speech. You just need them as kind of like reminders. However, I think this is a challenge worth conquering because clarity in your note taking actually aids clarity in your speech quite a lot. And this is the hill that I will die on. And this very short lecture, I will mostly focus on handwritten notes. Uh, but I think a lot of this can be applicable also if you write notes on your laptop. One more thing to bear in mind, uh, I think note taking as a speaker is a very individual practice, and I will just share what works for me and for people that I've observed in my own environment. But obviously, if you are someone who has very specific challenges with note taking, for example, you maybe have dyslexia, my advice might not be so applicable. After some of the advice that I will share, I will also aim to provide a quick exercise that I think can help you incorporate this in your own debating. So, to move on with the advices. Advice number one is do not write a lot. Probably the biggest mistake that I see is that people aim to write down a lot, often on autopilot, meaning they don't think about the things that they're writing down. They don't inspect if this is really necessary. They just, do it. I think, first of all, this is a useless waste of resources because some of the things that you're writing down on your paper, you will say anyway in your speech without a need to be reminded of. And B, I think this can also cause panic because in a debate, you obviously have a very limited amount of time to write things down. And if you feel the need to write a lot, then you will constantly feel as if you're catching up and as if there is not enough time, which obviously then raises stress of being in a debate. I feel this is often why being a prime minister is so stressful, exactly because we don't have a lot of time to write things down. If this is already the advice, then what should you write down? I think you should write down key points. Uh, and they are headline of an argument. For example, this policy will lead to a reduction in economic growth. Uh, a mechanism supporting the headline of your argument. For example, higher taxes disincentivize investments. Three, I think you should write down your impacts. And three, you should write down your comparatives. I think these are probably the four most important things to write down. So a headline of an argument, a key mech supporting that headline, an impact, and a comparative. Note that key mechanisms, impacts, and comparatives should be written down in brief words, not full sentences. I think headline of an argument is probably the only place where you might do a full sentence. All of this applies also if you're writing a rebuttal, right? You want to write down the headline of the argument that you're refuting. You want to write down your key mechs or mechanisms supporting your claim that this argument is not good or doesn't work or is a comparative or the impacts are not there. And you want to write down the conclusion coming from that. Here again, you should write all of these down in very brief notes. So in brief words, not in full sentences. How to practice writing down less? I think there are a couple of ways to practice it, depending on the level of skill and torture that you want to push yourself through. First way to practice it is to prep a motion for 15 minutes and write as if you were to do a PM speech. Then take your notes and inspect. Where can I cut? Where have I written more than I actually do need to? Then like write the speech down again, but in using 2 times less paper than previously, and then try to give a speech like that. If initially you use 6 papers, then now you will use 3 papers, and then you will try to give a speech in that way. Second way to practice it is to do a 1 paper speech, which basically is quite trivially that you should do a speech with only 1 paper that you like wrote for that speech. I think probably this is easiest to practice with a PM speech. You just use 1 paper and you give a speech, and then you reflect after that. You actually think about, okay, so where actually like was I fine without paper? And where actually did they need to write a bit more? I think this then gives you a very good insight into how your brain works and where actually you do need a bit more reminding on the paper and where actually you're completely fine and you don't need to write a lot. And the final way to exercise, and I think quite fun but very tough, is to try and do a speech with no notes. Funnily enough, I think this is a very good way to, again, see where do I actually need notes and where am I fine with improvising. Again, this is also quite useful, and as soon as you get comfortable with improvising in your speech a bit, I think this will then lower the pressure to write up a lot of notes, and again, it will help you to figure out what is actually most important for me to write down and where I'm totally fine just speaking from my own head. One thing to note here, from your experience, if you are EFL or ESL speaker, it is a bit tough to try and write down less because very often your word economy might not be the best. And because there is a language barrier, you might want to write down more words so that when you go on a stage and like the adrenaline hits, you don't forget a word. The advice that I found quite useful here is to write down more complex words. Write down words that you know will be challenging to remember. Write down words or phrases that you're not using very commonly, that you're not so familiar with, or phrases that you really wish to emphasize in the speech because, they sound good or it's very strategic for you to use those specific phrases. In that sense, I would say write down that specifically on your speech and use it as a crutch. Because I do believe it is a bit tougher to, do a one sheet speech if you are someone who is ESL or EFL. So this is the first advice. Try to write down less. Second advice is aim for your paper to be clean and neat. So what does this mean? First of all, do not overcrowd your paper. Even if you wish to write a lot still, it is better to use multiple papers and split the content than it is to crowd everything in 2 or 3 sheets. Paper is recyclable. There is no reason to be stingy with paper. For example, I think a simple rule can be if you're doing a whip speech, maybe each question in the debate gets 1 paper, or if you're doing team by team whip speech, then every team gets 1 paper. If you are doing first speeches, then maybe every argument can get 1 paper. I think it is important to not overcrowd your paper, first of all, because if paper is more crowded, it's more likely like for the whole paper to be messy, and as a consequence, your speech might be messy. And secondly, and maybe like trivially, it is easier to see what have you written down if you are not using very small like letters, which you kind of need to do if you overcrowd your paper. And this is especially important if like the debate desk is very low, or like you're very tall, or your eyesight is not very good and stuff like that. So I think this is why it is better to not overcrowd your paper. Second thing on this is your handwriting needs to be decent. It doesn't need to be perfect. This is not calligraphy, but it needs to be decent for 2 reasons. Firstly, I think under the adrenaline rush that everyone has when they give a speech, we often get confused with our own handwriting. And again, as I said at the beginning, we stop mid-speech, we disrupt the flow of speech, and it makes us less comfortable, less confident, stuff like that. Secondly, sometimes your partner might need to look at your notes. For example, if you are a member of government and you're extending, your whip speaker might wish to see how you structure your speech. And even if they don't wish to see it, it's very useful if you can show it to them so that they can also read on it. Having decent handwriting helps a lot here. A way to practice this, and something that I was pushed to do, is write down your PM speech and then give the notes to your partner, and then they should see if they can decipher everything which you have written down. And in most extreme way, they should do a full speech just from your notes. Again, very extreme, but if you wish to kind of be better at this, I think it's a very useful exercise. Couple of additional things on like making your paper very clean is it is useful to split the paper in different sections which are clearly differentiated. For example, it should be very clear what is the title or the headline of your argument, like where are the mechanisms and what is the impact and what is the comparative. Like for example, when I do a PM speech, my paper for my first argument will have in big letters at the top the headline of my argument. Then in bullet points, I will write down all of the mechanisms. Like below, I will write down the word impact, like with a question mark, and then write the impact summary. And then at the bottom of my paper, I will write down the word comparative, again with a question mark, and then write down my comparative summary. Same goes for a rebuttal speech. It should be very clearly noticeable from your paper what is the argument that you're like responding to and what are your issues with their argument. Ideally also split in bullet points because everyone should have multiple different responses to a well-built argument like from another side. And at the end, you should write your conclusion of your rebuttal. How to practice this? The most useful way that I saw is to try and print out a version of a paper which has predefined sections. For example, if you're doing first speeches, then this predefined paper might have a headline of an argument, a mechanism, impact, comparative, like already like written down in specific section and boxes, so you cannot deviate from that structure. The structure is already there, and you should only fill those gaps, like fill in the blanks. In this way, you're training your brain to get used to having a very clear structure. In the video description, I will leave one prepared argument sheet I have used when I practice this. So I think this is quite useful. Finally, on making sure your paper is clean, use colors and highlight most important things in your speech. Again, quite trivially, but I don't see enough people doing this. And I think it's such a useful way to be reminded of what you actually need to say. So in every speech and in every like notes that we write, not everything will be like 100% important, but some things will be. And making sure those really important bits are highlighted is quite useful. And again, this will also push for you to slow down when you actually say these things, to emphasize them a bit more and make sure that they stand out and that panel actually gets all of them. Okay, so this is advice number 2, aim to make your paper clean. Advice number 3 is listen more than you write, especially if you are a second speaker. There is a tendency of second speakers, especially, to always be frantically writing down things throughout the whole debate. This is often very harmful because it means that you don't often properly hear what is the actual mechanization or impacting of an argument that you need to respond to. Also, sometimes we just don't think automatically of a very good response to an argument, or maybe our response is non-strategic. And this is why I think it's very useful before you write something on your paper as a second speaker, like before you write down like your response, think about it a bit more. Make sure that you have listened fully and understand fully what the other side is actually saying and proposing. I think this is very important also for the speakers who often end up like rebutting the same argument twice because a similar argument was maybe done also by opening and closing, and they have failed to kind of see this because they were just like frantically writing everything down. So I think this is why like listening more than writing is useful. Again, I think the reason why you should do it is because it will be impossible like for you to write everything down, both in the sense of like transcribing what the other speaker have said, but also in everything that you have to say on the argument. So listening a bit more and thinking before going into writing, I think it's quite useful. Exercise for this, I think it's useful to listen to a recorded PM speech and then aim to write only in 3 or 4 brief bullet points how you would respond to that speech. I think this pushes you to be quite succinct in your writing, and it pushes you to like listen more than you write. In a more extreme version, you can do a rebuttal speech with no notes at all. So just from the top of your head, and in this way you can see where actually you need the paper, and where actually it was useful to just like listen a bit more and not write anything. So this is advice number 3, and that is to listen more than you write, especially if you're doing second speeches. Advice number 4 is, and quite trivially, go over your paper before you go to speak. I would say last 30 seconds of like before your speech should be spent on arranging your papers in order and going over the whole speech in your mind. This, in my opinion, should not be done when you're already at the stage. This should be done when you're sitting in your spot. And even though maybe the previous speaker is still speaking, like let's face it, I think like the last like 20 seconds of someone's speech is usually not like when they say the most important bits. So I think it is fine for you to kind of like tune out and arrange your papers in order, and then briefly go over each of them and kind of doing a mini rehearsal of that speech in your head. I think again, this is useful because you can like rehearse it then and not meet your papers fully only when you go out to give a speech. So this kind of like mini rehearsal from papers is useful to do before you go to stage. Okay, so this is advice number 4. Advice number 5 is some papers are not to be included in your speech. So there is a use in having papers which just serve as sheets for tracking what other teams say and do, and they are not to be like basically like used for a speech. For example, like biggest application that I found of this is when I do a whip speech. In those instances, I have one overview sheet of paper that I split in 3 different columns. There, I track main claims of all teams. And later, once I figure out what is most important to be responded to in the context of my partner's case, then I transfer some of those points into my actual speech papers. Okay, so this is advice number 5. Advice number 6, trivially again, practice fast writing. From my own anecdotal experience, I really saw that there is a huge benefit in being someone who writes things down fast. This is a skill that we are losing collectively because outside of debating, we do not write down things that much anymore. However, in a context of a round, when a lot is happening, it is very useful to write down things fast, and it helps you prepare faster, be less panicked, because you know that at the end of the day, you will be able to write down everything that you want. How to practice it? I think very simply, just do a regular prep for a PM speech, but every time the actual time for writing should be shorter and shorter. For example, if your prep is 15 minutes, then maybe, 6 or 7 minutes will be used for you to write your papers in the first iteration. Then in the second iteration of like writing down the same paper or of the same prep, you need to do it in like less and less minutes. I think again, this kind of is pushing you to be like efficient with like what you write, but also to write down a bit faster. Final advice, which is not advice, maybe it's more as a nudge, and that is to experiment and try out. We are all different, and for like the longest time I was really baffled by the fact that I just wanted someone to give me a very concrete and like clear way how to write down my notes. And I tried everything that people around me and like older debaters did, but I like none of that worked specifically for me, and bits of that worked for me. The only way to figure out like what actually works for you is to experiment with different type of note taking. If you wish to get like very good at it, use spar rounds to test different techniques and methods. Maybe you need to like write down less, maybe more, maybe you need to try like handwritten notes, or maybe you should try to do them on like a laptop if you're like used to doing the other way around. Maybe figure out like what's the best, what type of pen even works for you and stuff like that, right? Experiment and see what suits your cognition, your brain wiring, and your handwriting the best. This is the only way to figure out actually the best way to do like notes for your speech. I hope this was useful, and good luck with enhancing your note taking in the future.